My name is Lucy Jack, and I was 8 years old when I learned that love in my family had a price tag, a calendar, and a destination. The day I graduated from high school, my car was already packed with everything I owned. By midnight, I was unpacking in a small apartment 2 states away, and my parents had no idea where I was. It took them 4 long years to track me down. And when they finally walked into the small floral shop I had built from the ground up, 2,200 miles away from our house in Illinois, my mother didn't look at me with tears of relief. She didn't wrap her arms around me. She looked around at my display racks, my cold room coolers, and the ribbon counter, pressed her lips into a thin line, and proved to me in 6 short words that she hadn't driven across the country to find her missing daughter. She had driven all that way to repossess an asset she thought belonged to her. The blue trunk showed up on the end of my bed on the last Tuesday of May. It was navy vinyl, hard-shelled, with dull silver clasps that clicked like small traps closing. My mother presented it to me with the bright, theatrical smile she usually reserved for church social events. She told me it was my very own big girl traveling chest. I was 8 years old, so I thought trunks meant train rides, and train rides meant mountain parks, because that is where my older brother, Ethan, had gone with my parents the previous summer. Instead, 3 days later, my father loaded the trunk into the back of our station wagon and drove 4 hours east to a small town in Indiana where my Aunt Sarah lived in a tall, quiet house that smelled of cinnamon tea and damp soil. My parents stayed just long enough to drink a glass of lemonade on the porch. Then my father carried the trunk up the stairs to a small guest room under the eaves. My mother knelt beside me on the braided rug, took my chin between her fingers, and said the words that would become the anthem of my youth. "Quiet children don't cause trouble, Lucy." She kissed my forehead, walked down to the car, and drove away with my father and Ethan, bound for an ocean resort on the East Coast. I stood by the window and watched their taillights disappear down the oak-lined avenue. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I was already very good at being invisible, which should have warned someone right then. But here is the truth that took me 15 years to fully understand. That trip to the coast had been planned in January. The trunk had been purchased in March. Nobody said a single word to me until the morning we left in May. They had spent 5 months building a summer that didn't include me before anyone decided I was old enough to be handed my sentence. Before we dive deeper into this story, hit that subscribe button right now to see how this unravels. Type in the comments which country or state you are watching from today. I personally read and reply to them because I would love to say hello to you and see just how far our story is traveling across the world. Now, let me tell you what happened when the first postcard finally arrived in Aunt Sarah's mailbox. Every summer after that followed the exact same script. The second week of June, the blue trunk went into the trunk of the car. 4 hours east, a quick tea at Aunt Sarah's table, and then the car pulled away with 3 people inside. Sometime in mid-July, a postcard would arrive in Aunt Sarah's rural mailbox, written in my mother's neat, looped cursive. Orlando the first year, Yellowstone the next, then San Francisco, Maine, and the Grand Canyon. 9 summers, 9 postcards, 9 versions of a family that only existed when I wasn't in the frame. Every single card carried the exact same closing line above her signature. "Wish you were here." Aunt Sarah would hand me those cards without saying a word. But later, through the gap in the pantry door, I'd watch her slide them into an old shoebox she kept on the top shelf, almost like she was gathering evidence for a trial that hadn't been scheduled yet. I used to trace the glossy pictures on the front of those cards, looking for something that wasn't there. It took me years to realize what was actually missing. Not once did a card say, "We miss you." Not once did my mother write, "Next year, you'll come with us." The cards weren't sent as a message of love. They were captions to an audience. Look at the complete family having its perfect getaway. When September rolled around, my 3rd grade teacher would ask everyone to write an essay on times what I did on my summer vacation. I'd write about helping Aunt Sarah weed her wildflower garden, press roses, and dry lavender. My teacher would give me an A, and my mother would pin it on the refrigerator right next to a framed photo of Ethan riding a jet ski in South Carolina. 2 completely different realities held up by the exact same magnet. By the time I was 12, I stopped writing those essays honestly. I just made up stories about amusement parks I'd never seen. Nobody in my house ever noticed the difference, which told me far more about my home than the postcards ever did. To understand why my parents acted this way, I have to give you the context, because I believe in being completely accurate, fair to them, but not a single inch more. The dynamic didn't start with the blue trunk. It started in a hospital ward. When Ethan was 7 and I was 3, he was diagnosed with a severe kidney condition. I don't remember those years, but I grew up inside their shadow. 3 years of surgeries, specialist visits, and church prayer chains. My mother slept in a hospital armchair for so many months that her posture permanently changed. My father worked endless overtime to keep up with the medical bills. In that long emergency, my family reshaped itself around a single center point. And that center point was Ethan. A house on fire organizes around the flame. I get that. Ethan went into full recovery when he was 10 and I was 6. The doctors cleared him, the church rang the bells, and a banner was hung across our porch. That should have been the end of the crisis. Instead, it became our permanent blueprint. Have you ever felt like an extra in your own family's story? Drop a comment below with the word invisible if you know what it feels like to be overlooked. The summer I turned 11, I decided to take a stand. The destination that year was the Rocky Mountains, and I wanted to see them so badly my teeth ached. I prepared my argument for 3 weeks. I packed my small cloth bag early, and I drew a neat, numbered list on notebook paper titled Times Reasons I Should Come This Year. My top reason was simple. I had never seen a real mountain in my life. I rehearsed my presentation in front of the bathroom mirror until my voice didn't shake. That evening, I stepped into the kitchen while my mother was wiping down the granite counters, and my father was standing near the back door, jingling his car keys. I delivered my speech with my shoulders square and my paper held tightly in both hands. My mother stopped wiping. She set her dishcloth down, walked over, and knelt in front of me just like she had 3 years earlier. Her hands were warm, her voice smooth as silk. "Lucy, sweetheart," she whispered, looking into my eyes. "This trip is for your brother. After everything his body has suffered, he needs these memories. You understand, don't you?" When my chin began to quiver, she reached out, tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, and delivered the knockout punch. Quiet children don't cause trouble. My father didn't say a single word. He just stood by the door, staring out the window, spinning his keys. His silence was an instrument he played with absolute mastery. I turned around, walked up the stairs, and went into my room without crying out loud. I listened to the hum of the dishwasher, the faint laughter from the television downstairs, and the rhythm of a house that had already moved on without me. But at 9 o'clock that evening, I heard a sound that made my breath freeze in my chest, the low rumble of hard plastic wheels rolling down the hardwood hallway. I crept to my bedroom door and looked out. My navy blue trunk was already sitting by the front door, fully packed, latched, and zipped. I hadn't touched it. Someone had packed my clothes for me hours before I ever gave my speech in the kitchen. The decision had been made in April, signed off in May, and sealed long before I ever built up the courage to ask for a seat in the car. That night, I stopped asking. I learned that asking for a place at their table was just an invitation to be reminded that the menu wasn't made for me. While my home in Illinois was a wasteland of silent rejection, Aunt Sarah's house in Indiana was the complete opposite. She was my mother's elder sister, a woman who had spent 40 years cultivating herbs, running a small flower stall, and living on her own terms. At Aunt Sarah's house, I wasn't the extra child. I was just Lucy. She taught me how to prune stems, mix soil blends, and wrap bouquets in butcher paper with twine. One evening, while we were sitting on her back porch watching the fireflies, she looked at me over her tea glass and said, "Lucy, in this house, you don't have to earn your space by being invisible." Have you ever felt like you had to shrink yourself just to fit into someone else's life? Type, "never again," in the comments if you are learning to take up space. The summer I turned 12, I discovered the true depth of the wall built between my life and my parents' home. It happened on a muggy July night in Indiana. I had gone downstairs to the kitchen to fetch a glass of ice water when I saw a line of yellow lights stretching across the dark floor from Aunt Sarah's small office. I stopped near the doorway because her voice was sharp, a tone I had never heard her use before. "She's 12 years old, Carol," Aunt Sarah was saying into the receiver, her knuckles white around the phone. "Let her live with me full-time. Enroll her in the school down the road. I'll cover her clothes, her books, her medical visits. You and Arthur can focus entirely on Ethan, without pretending Lucy is just on a summer retreat." There was a long pause. The only sound was the hum of the old refrigerator and the distant crickets outside. Then Aunt Sarah spoke again, her voice dropping into a register so cold it cut through the room like glass. "That's your reason? Because of how it would look to your church committee? You can't handle people asking why your daughter doesn't live under your roof, but you have no problem shipping her off every June like unwanted freight. That isn't parenting, Carol. That's staging." I stood frozen in the dark hallway, holding my empty glass. Aunt Sarah turned, caught sight of my shadow near the door, and instantly changed her expression back to her usual gentle smile. She hung up the phone, walked over, and led me back upstairs without another word about the call. But the damage was done. I lay in bed that night, realizing that my exclusion wasn't an accident, nor was it a temporary sacrifice for my brother's recovery. It was a calculated policy designed to keep up appearances while ensuring I took up as little emotional and financial space as possible. Something shifted inside me that night. The little girl who waited on the porch for the station wagon to turn around stopped existing. In her place grew a strategist. By the time I turned 14, I bought a small black leather notebook at a school supply sale. On the very first page, I wrote a single date, the 15th of June 2015. The day after my high school graduation. Underneath that date, I began outlining my exit strategy. I calculated every penny required for complete independence. I mapped out rent costs in distant states, secondhand car prices, and emergency savings. When I turned 16, I got a job at a local diner 3 miles from our house, working 40 hours a week during the school year, and saving every dollar of my tips. When my mother asked why I was working so hard, I told her I was saving for college textbooks. She smiled, praised my independence to her friends, and went back to planning Ethan's high school victory trips. By the spring of my senior year, my secret shoebox hidden under the floorboards of my closet held $6,800 in cash. I didn't apply to the state university my parents talked about. Instead, I used the computer at the public library to locate a small town far away, bought a reliable used hatchback for cash, and prepared my final move. If you've ever had to quietly build your own escape plan while keeping your head down, drop a "free" in the comments right now. Graduation day arrived on the second Saturday of June. The morning sun was already blazing over the high school football field as hundreds of folding chairs sat arranged in neat rows across the grass. I had been up since 4 in the morning. Before anyone else in my house had even stirred, I carried my navy blue trunk, the very same trunk my mother had bought me 10 years prior, down the back stairs, and loaded it into the trunk of my hatchback. Beside it went my box of clothes, my botanical supplies, and the shoebox, holding $6,800 in cash. My parents and Ethan did come to the ceremony. I want to be entirely clear about that, because accuracy is the only weapon I care to use. They sat in the middle section, 4 rows back. But 40 minutes into the procession, right as the students with surnames starting with the letter C were walking across the platform, my mother leaned over, patted my shoulder, and whispered that they had to slip out early. Ethan's college prep club was hosting a midday kickoff luncheon in the next city over, and traffic on the bypass was going to be heavy. She squeezed my hand tightly, smiled her polished church smile, and whispered, "We are just so proud of how self-sufficient you are, Lucy." When the announcer finally called out my name, times Lucy Jack, times I walked across the wooden stage, accepted my diploma cover from a school board member I barely knew, and looked out into the sea of faces. The 2 chairs where my parents had been sitting were empty, a couple of discarded event programs resting on the vinyl seats. A strange feeling settled over me right then. It didn't burn, and it didn't bring tears to my eyes. It felt like a final receipt. It was the universe itemizing the exact balance of my worth in that house, so I could walk away without a single debt of guilt. That evening, I ate a quiet dinner with them at the kitchen table. I listened to Ethan talk about his upcoming summer trip to Europe, pass the salad bowl, and answer politely when my mother asked if I was excited for my morning shift at the diner. I said I was tired, went upstairs to my room, and waited. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I stood in the middle of the room I had occupied for 18 years. I placed a short note on the kitchen island downstairs, waited under the sugar bowl so no breeze could knock it to the floor. The note contained only 11 words. I am safe. I am an adult. Please do not search for me. I signed it simply with the letter times L. I backed my car down the driveway with the headlights turned off, only flipping them on once I reached the main avenue. I drove through the night, crossing state lines as the sun began to rise. 3 days and 2,200 miles later, I arrived in a small, coastal valley town in Oregon, surrounded by dark green pines and mist-covered hills. Have you ever had to walk away from everything you knew just to preserve your sanity, share your story, or drop a strong in the comments down below? The town was called Emerald Bay, nestled between dense pine forests and the Pacific coast. It was cold, damp, and smelled of salt water and cedar, a complete contrast to the hot, flat summers of Illinois. On my second day in town, I traded my old cell phone for a cheap burner at a grocery store counter, dropping my old phone into a recycling bin behind a gas station. The old number, the one my mother had saved under her emergency contacts, vanished into silence. I rented a small studio apartment over an auto repair garage for $400 a month. The baseboard heaters groaned, the water took 5 minutes to warm up, and the floorboards creaked under every footstep. But it was mine. Every square inch of that room was paid for by tip money I had earned with my own hands. Within a week, I found a job at a local floral shop called Times the Petal and Vine. The owner was a 60-year-old woman named Martha, who ran her shop with strict precision and zero tolerance for slacking. She didn't ask many questions when I applied, only asking if I knew how to handle shears and keep stems alive. I showed her how Aunt Sarah had taught me to cut stems at an angle under cold water, strip low leaves to prevent bacteria, and bind wild stems with twine. Martha watched me for 5 minutes, crossed her arms, and said, "Your aunt knew her craft. You start tomorrow at 7. 11 days after I arrived in Oregon, a local police officer knocked on my garage apartment door. My heart pounded against my ribs as I opened it, but I already knew who had triggered the visit. My mother had filed a missing person report back home, and the trail had ended with my first card swipe at a gas station near the state border. I showed the officer my driver's license, my new apartment lease, and my tax forms from the flower shop. He glanced at the documents, looked at me standing calmly in the doorway, and asked the standard legal question. "Are you staying here of your own free will, ma'am?" "Yes," I replied clearly. "I am 18, I am employed, and I left voluntarily." He had me sign a form confirming I was a safe, self-sufficient adult. "We'll notify your local department that you've been located and that you're safe," he explained, tapping his notepad. "By law, we cannot reveal your address or location to your family without your permission. Have a good evening." That was the miracle of legal adulthood. The very system my mother expected to bring me back to my knees had instead drawn an iron curtain between us. Over the next 4 years, I poured my soul into Times the Petal and Vine. When Martha developed severe arthritis in her hands, I took over the heavy lifting, the early morning market runs, and the custom bridal arrangements. By my 4th year, Martha sat me down over coffee and offered to sell me the business on a seller-financed arrangement, $25,000 down, and monthly payments carved out of the shop's profits. I put up a chart inside my closet door and tracked every dollar saved. Have you ever had to work twice as hard just to prove to yourself that you could survive on your own? Type "built not given" in the comments if you paved your own path. I had one rule during those 4 years in Oregon: keep my head down, keep my work local, and never put my face on the internet. But business has its own demands. A local lifestyle magazine ran a cover feature on small-town artisans, and Martha, who loved pushing me into the light, volunteered me for the cover photo. I stood by our walk-in cooler holding an arrangement of wild lilies and eucalyptus, smiling for the camera. 3 weeks later, the article went live on their website, and local paper websites don't have geoblockers. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in late October. The smell of cut stems and wet moss filled the air, and I was behind the counter assembling a wedding bouquet. The brass chime above the front door rang. "Welcome to the Petal and Vine. I'll be right with you," I said automatically without looking up from my ribbon spool. "So this is where you've been playing shopkeeper, Lucy?" The voice hit me like a bucket of ice water poured down my spine. I lifted my gaze. Standing between the sunflower display and the register was my mother, wearing her tailored wool coat and her Sunday church pearl necklace. 4 years of silence, 4 years of freedom, dissolved into the air in a single second. Behind her stood my father, holding the door open. He looked thinner, his hair almost completely white, and his right hand was hooked into his jacket pocket, trembling with a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm. I didn't scream. I didn't drop my shears. 4 years of running a business teaches a person how to stay grounded on their own floor. I looked my mother in the eyes and waited. She walked around the central display, her manicured fingers dragging across the wooden tables, as if checking for dust. 4 years, she murmured, her voice laced with sharp judgment. "You left a note under a sugar bowl, changed your phone, and ran away to sell flowers in the woods. Do you have any idea what your father and I went through explaining your absence to our community?" "You didn't drive 2,000 miles to check my inventory, Mom," I said, keeping my tone flat and controlled. "Why are you here?" My mother straightened her shoulders and placed her purse on my counter. "Your father was diagnosed with severe Parkinson's 6 months ago. His mobility is dropping quickly, and he needs round-the-clock assistance." I looked at my father. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at the wooden floorboards, his hand twitching inside his pocket. "Ethan has his law firm now," my mother continued, her tone shifting seamlessly into that soft, manipulative pitch I knew so well. "He has a career, a mortgage, and a future to build. He can't be burdened with elder care. But you've always been the independent one, Lucy. You've had your fun out here. It's time to pack up this little hobby shop, move back to Illinois, and take care of your family." The recall notice had arrived. The job opening for the quiet child who expected nothing was open again, and I was being summoned to fill it. If your family ever expected you to sacrifice your hard-earned peace just to fix their problems, drop a "no way" in the comments right now. I looked down at my mother's hand resting on my polished wood counter. 4 years of silence, thousands of miles, a legal shield, and a life I had carved out of raw determination. And her very first request was in order to surrender it all. "No," I said, my voice steady, quiet, and absolutely unyielding. My mother blinked, taken aback as if I had spoken in a foreign language. "Excuse me? Lucy, your father is sick." "I heard you, Mom," I interrupted smoothly, "and my answer is no. I am not closing my shop, and I am not moving back to Illinois." Her face hardened, dropping the soft act instantly. "You selfish, ungrateful girl. We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us? By hiding in the woods while your family suffers? You gave me a blue trunk every June, Mom," I replied, staring directly into her eyes. "You gave me 9 postcards that said 'Times wish you were here,' while you took Ethan on real vacations. You gave me an empty room every summer so I wouldn't mess up your perfect family portrait." My father let out a soft, choked rasp from the doorway, but my mother cut him off. "We are leaving," she snapped, grabbing her handbag. "And if you don't come back home for Thanksgiving next month to make this right, don't ever call yourself a Jack again." They left, the brass bell chiming aggressively behind them. But I knew that running away wasn't going to settle this debt. I needed to face the room where all these ghosts were created. A month later, I flew back to Illinois for Thanksgiving. I didn't stay at my parents' house. I booked a room at a small inn down the street, because a boundary you can't walk away from isn't a boundary at all. I walked into my childhood home carrying a large floral arrangement of winter pines and white lilies. The dining room was filled with 12 people, relatives, neighbors, and Ethan with his new fiancée. The table was set with fine china and folded linen napkins. Before the turkey was even carved, my mother stood up at the head of the table, clinked her crystal glass with a silver spoon, and announced brightly, "Everyone, before we begin, I have wonderful news. Lucy has finally realized her place is with us. She is moving back from Oregon to serve as your Uncle Frank's primary caregiver. The table erupted into light applause. Relatives chimed in with, "What a good daughter," and "How noble of you, Lucy." I stood up slowly, picking up my glass. The room fell silent as I looked around at the 12 faces, expecting me to bow my head and accept the burden. "I am not moving back," I stated clearly. The applause died instantly. "Lucy," my mother hissed under her breath, "I have arranged and fully funded a certified home care agency here in town," I continued, looking directly at my father. "A professional nurse will come 3 days a week to assist Dad with his mobility, therapy, and meals. I have already paid the first 6 months out of my shop's savings. The invoices come directly to me in Oregon." My mother's face flushed red with rage. "You think you can just buy your way out of your family duties?" "I am securing proper care for Dad," I said calmly, "and I am protecting my life. From this day forward, my name will never be used in a family announcement I didn't write myself. If you've ever had to stand your ground against an entire room of people who tried to guilt trip you, drop, standing tall, in the comments right now." My mother stood frozen at the head of the table, her hands trembling as she clutched her linen napkin. "You selfish girl," she whispered, her voice cracking across the silent room. "After everything this family gave you, you drop a check on the table and think it makes up for abandoning your sick father?" I didn't raise my voice. I leaned forward, resting my palms on the polished mahogany. "You didn't give me a family, Mom. You gave me a blue trunk every June so I wouldn't ruin your family photos. You gave me 9 years of postcards while you gave Ethan your time." Before my mother could launch into her usual script, my father did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He stood up, using both hands to brace himself against the edge of the table, his right hand shaking violently from the tremors. "Enough, Carol," my father rasped, his voice rough from disuse. The entire room gasped. My mother turned to him, her mouth open in absolute shock. My father reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulled out a yellowed piece of paper, folded into a tiny square, and tossed it across the white tablecloth toward me. "Read it, Lucy," he said quietly. "Read it out loud." I picked up the paper and unfolded it. It was a receipt from a private investigator's office in Chicago, dated August 2016, 14 months after I had disappeared. At the bottom of the document, marked in red ink, were the words, "Times search terminated, at client request." Beneath that stamp, in my father's shaky handwriting, was a brief note. "Found her town. Carol says stop. She'll return when she runs out of money." I looked up from the paper to my father's eyes. Tears were pooling in the corners of his eyelids. He hadn't just let me go, he had actively looked for me, tracked me down, and then surrendered to my mother's demand to leave me stranded. "I looked for you, Lucy," my father choked out, his shoulders sagging. "I found where you went, and I let her convince me to leave you there. That was my cowardice, not yours." My mother looked around the room, but for the first time in her life, the audience didn't applaud her. Aunt Sarah stood up from her seat at the end of the table, walked over to me, and put her arm around my shoulders. "Come on, Lucy," Aunt Sarah said gently. "Your dinner is waiting in Indiana." We walked out of that house, leaving the gold-rimmed china, the swans, and the unfinished arguments behind. That was 2 years ago. Today, the home care agency I hired continues to assist my father, and he calls me every Sunday afternoon. We don't talk about the past. We talk about the weather, the flowers I'm growing, and the simple things. My mother and I have not spoken a single word since that Thanksgiving, and I have finally made peace with that silence. At times, the Petal and Vine, Martha officially retired last spring, and my name is painted on the front glass door. Last Thanksgiving, instead of flying back east, I pushed 4 long work tables together inside the flower shop. Aunt Sarah flew out from Indiana, Martha brought her family, and we invited our neighbors, local regulars, and anyone in town who didn't have a place to go. We set a table for 24 people amidst the fresh blooms and pine branches. No scripts, no announcements, and no blue trunks waiting by the door. Family isn't built on blood or obligatory sacrifices. It is built by the people who choose to sit at your table without asking you to shrink yourself first. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you've ever had to set firm boundaries to protect your own peace type, I chose me. In the comments below, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Revenge Petal for more stories of strength, survival, and starting over. I'll see you in the next chapter.